March 2, 1969. Zhenbao Island, Ussuri River. Major Ivan Strelnikov pressed his binoculars against the frosted observation port, watching the frozen river stretch white and endless toward the Chinese shore. At 8:40 a.m., the temperature sat at -20 Celsius, cold enough that diesel fuel thickened in tank engines, cold enough that metal burned exposed skin. Through the morning haze, he counted them. Approximately 50 Chinese soldiers, moving in formation across the ice toward this desolate, snow-covered island that both nations claimed as their own. "They're coming again," he muttered to his radio operator. "Fourth day in a row." What Strelnikov didn't know, couldn't know, was that Chinese forces had been rehearsing this exact scenario for weeks on a mock-up 200 kilometers inland. What he didn't know was that the soldiers approaching weren't simply border guards making another symbolic incursion. They were People's Liberation Army regulars carrying AK-47s with live ammunition, under orders to provoke a confrontation that would teach the Soviet revisionists a lesson. What he especially didn't know was that hidden in the tree line on the Chinese side, Type 62 light tanks sat waiting, engines warm, crews ready. By 9:17 a.m., 31 Soviet border guards would be dead on the ice. Within 2 weeks, both communist giants would deploy nuclear-capable forces to their shared border. And the unthinkable would become thinkable. That the world's two largest communist powers might incinerate each other, while America and the West watched in stunned silence. The Sino-Soviet split had gone from ideological argument to shooting war, and nobody in Moscow or Beijing seemed entirely sure how to stop it. In early 1969, both communist giants believed they understood exactly what was happening along their 4,380-kilometer border, and both were catastrophically wrong about what the other side would tolerate. "The Chinese are engaging in provocations," Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev told the Politburo on January 23, 1969. "They push, we push back. They retreat. This is the pattern. They are testing our resolve, nothing more." The Soviet leadership viewed the escalating border incidents through the lens of their own doctrine. Superior Soviet military power would inevitably deter Chinese adventurism. The Red Army had crushed Nazi Germany. They had 10,000 nuclear warheads. What could Mao's peasant army possibly accomplish against such overwhelming force? Soviet intelligence assessments from February 1969 predicted that China, still reeling from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, would never risk major military confrontation. "The Chinese economy is in shambles," one GRU report noted. "Their military modernization has stalled. They possess perhaps 20 to 30 primitive nuclear devices. They will bluster, but they will not fight." This confidence was reinforced by recent patterns. During 1968, there had been 488 border incidents along the Ussuri River alone, all ending in standoffs or minor scuffles. In Beijing, Mao Zedong and his inner circle had reached precisely the opposite conclusion. The Soviets were paper tigers who would fold under determined pressure. "The Soviet revisionists have grown soft," Mao declared to the Central Military Commission in January 1969. "They value their comfortable lives in Moscow more than communist principle. A sharp blow will expose their weakness." This wasn't mere rhetoric. Chinese strategic thinking had evolved dramatically since the split widened in 1963. While the Soviets saw China as weak, Mao saw the USSR as overextended. Forces spread from Eastern Europe to the Far East, an economy straining under military spending, and a leadership that had replaced revolutionary fervor with bureaucratic caution. Chinese Defense Minister Lin Biao articulated the strategic calculation, "We will choose the time and place. We will strike hard and fast, inflict casualties, and withdraw. The Soviets will bluster and threaten, but they will not escalate to nuclear war over a frozen sandbar in a river." This assessment was based on careful study of Soviet behavior during previous border incidents, where Moscow had consistently chosen restraint over escalation. Both sides fundamentally misread each other's red lines. The Soviets believed China would never initiate serious military action. The Chinese believed the Soviets would never respond with overwhelming force. Both assumptions were about to shatter on the ice of the Ussuri River. The public dimension added another layer of miscalculation. Soviet citizens received carefully filtered news portraying Chinese provocations as the desperate actions of a failed regime. Chinese citizens, bombarded with cultural revolution propaganda about Soviet betrayal of Marxist-Leninism, were primed to support confrontation with the social imperialists. Neither population understood that their governments were stumbling toward a war that could dwarf World War II in casualties. The seeds of the Ussuri River clash were planted not in 1969, but in 1860, when Tsarist Russia forced the Qing dynasty to sign the Treaty of Peking, ceding vast territories north of the Amur River and east of the Ussuri River to Russian control. For over a century, this historical grievance simmered. When Mao Zedong came to power in 1949, he initially set it aside, focusing on alliance with the Soviet Union against the capitalist West. Today, we lean to one side, Mao announced in 1949, declaring China's alignment with Moscow. Through the 1950s, Soviet advisors flooded into China. Thousands of technicians, military experts, and engineers who helped build China's industrial base and armed forces. Stalin provided crucial support for Mao's consolidation of power. Khrushchev, despite private doubts about Mao's radicalism, maintained the alliance and even promised nuclear weapons technology assistance through the 1957 New Defense Technical Accord. The fracture began with ideology, but metastasized into something more dangerous. Mao viewed Khrushchev's 1956 denunciation of Stalin as betrayal, both of Stalin's memory and of revolutionary principles. When Khrushchev proposed peaceful coexistence with the West, Mao saw capitulation. How can you have peaceful coexistence with imperialism? He demanded at the 1957 Moscow conference. You either fight imperialism or you surrender to it. By 1959, the split had tangible consequences. Khrushchev, alarmed by Mao's cavalier attitude toward nuclear war. If the worst came to worst and half of mankind died, the other half would remain while imperialism would be razed to the ground, Mao had said, canceled the nuclear sharing agreement. In 1960, all Soviet advisors were abruptly withdrawn from China, taking their blueprints and leaving Chinese industrial projects half-finished. Then Mao did the unthinkable. He publicly challenged Soviet territorial holdings. There are too many places occupied by the Soviet Union, Mao told a Japanese socialist delegation in July 1964, in comments carefully calculated to reach Moscow. The Soviet Union has an area of 22 million square kilometers, and its population is only 200 million. About 100 years ago, the area east of Lake Baikal became Russian territory. And since then, Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, Kamchatka, and other areas have been Soviet territory. We have not yet presented our account for this list. In the Kremlin, these words landed like a bombshell. Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko warned, "This is not mere rhetoric. Mao is laying groundwork for territorial claims." He was right. Chinese cartographers began producing maps showing the unequal treaties borders, with vast swaths of Soviet Far East territory marked as historically Chinese. Chinese media started referring to Vladivostok by its Chinese name, Haishanwai. Border incidents, previously rare, accelerated. In 1964, 11 incidents. In 1965, 39. In 1966, 118. In 1967, 169. In 1968, 488. The pattern was clear to Soviet border officials. This was systematic, coordinated pressure. KGB chairman Yuri Andropov presented the Politburo with intelligence in late 1968 showing Chinese military preparations along the border. They are reinforcing positions, stockpiling supplies, conducting reconnaissance in force. This is not spontaneous. This is planned. But Soviet planners dismissed the threat. China's military was obsolete, still using Korean War-era tactics and weapons. The Soviet Far East forces, by contrast, had been modernized with T-62 tanks, Mi-24 helicopter gunships, and tactical nuclear weapons. What Soviet intelligence failed to grasp was the strategic purpose behind Chinese preparations. Beijing wasn't planning to conquer Soviet territory. They were planning a sharp, limited strike designed to demonstrate Soviet vulnerability and rally Chinese nationalism at a moment when the Cultural Revolution had thrown China into chaos. Lin Biao personally selected Zhenbao Island, called Damansky by the Soviets, as the target. Small enough to assault successfully, ambiguous enough in sovereignty to provide political cover, isolated enough to limit immediate Soviet reinforcement. Through January and February 1969, PLA units rehearsed the assault on mock-ups. Soldiers practiced close-quarters combat in extreme cold. Officers studied Soviet patrol patterns, noting that border guards on Zhenbao Island typically numbered 30 to 40 men. The plan was simple: ambush a Soviet patrol on the island, inflict heavy casualties, and withdraw before Soviet armor could respond. Chinese leadership calculated that the Soviets, shocked by the audacity and embarrassed by the casualties, would nevertheless choose restraint over escalation. They could not have been more wrong. March 1969, 9 next a.m. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Strelnikov led his patrol of 32 border guards across the ice toward Zhenbao Island. This was routine. Soviet forces had been intercepting Chinese patrols for days, engaging in shoving matches and shouted arguments before both sides withdrew. Strelnikov expected more of the same. The Chinese soldiers appeared ahead, perhaps 50 strong, moving in standard patrol formation. Strelnikov's men spread out, preparing for the usual confrontation. At approximately 9:15 a.m., the two groups met near the western shore of the island. What happened next lasted perhaps 90 seconds and changed everything. Without warning, without the verbal confrontation that had preceded every previous incident, the Chinese soldiers opened fire. Not warning shots, not shots in the air, aimed automatic weapons fire at point-blank range. They simply started shooting, survivor Private Mikhail Burlakov later testified. No provocation, no warning. One moment we were approaching, the next moment they were killing us. Strelnikov went down in the first volley, along with most of his forward section. The survivors, caught in the open on ice with no cover, returned fire but were hideously exposed. Chinese forces, who had clearly rehearsed this ambush, moved in coordinated teams. Some maintained suppressing fire while others maneuvered to flanking positions. Within minutes, Soviet casualties mounted catastrophically. Border Guard Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Leonov, monitoring from the Soviet shore, watched in horror through his binoculars. "I saw my men dying on the ice," he later wrote. "I saw them trying to crawl to cover that didn't exist. I saw the Chinese systematically executing the wounded." He immediately radioed for reinforcements and artillery support. By 9:45 a.m., Soviet artillery began dropping shells on Chinese positions on Zhenbao Island. Chinese forces, having inflicted devastating casualties, began withdrawing across the ice toward their shore. But they hadn't counted on Soviet fury, or Soviet doctrine, which called for immediate, overwhelming retaliation to any border violation. At 10:20 a.m., two Soviet BTR-60 armored personnel carriers crossed onto the ice from the Soviet shore, carrying reinforcements to recover the dead and wounded. Chinese forces, instead of fully withdrawing, had left behind concealed anti-tank teams. RPG-7 rockets streaked across the ice. The first BTR exploded, killing everyone inside. The second retreated under heavy fire. The senior Soviet commander in the region, Colonel Ivan Petrov, faced an impossible decision. 31 of his men were dead or dying on the ice. Chinese forces still occupied parts of the island. His superiors demanded immediate action, but his available forces were limited. The nearest tank battalion was 40 kilometers away and would take hours to arrive on roads clogged with snow. He chose to wait for armor, a decision that likely prevented the border clash from spiraling into immediate, full-scale war. But the wait was agony. Soviet soldiers could see some of their wounded still moving on the ice, slowly freezing to death. Chinese forces had withdrawn to prepared positions on their shore, daring the Soviets to pursue. March 15, 1969, 9:30 a.m., the Soviets returned to Zhenbao Island in overwhelming force. This time, there would be no ambush. This time, there would be no Chinese tactical surprise. Colonel Yuri Smirnov commanded the Soviet response. 2 companies of infantry supported by 6 T-62 main battle tanks and artillery positioned on both shores of the Ussuri River. The T-62 was the most advanced tank in the Soviet arsenal. 100 mm smoothbore gun, advanced armor, and fire control systems that outclassed anything in the Chinese inventory. At 9:30 a.m., Soviet forces advanced across the ice in battle formation. Chinese forces responded not with a patrol, but with a prepared military operation. From concealed positions on the Chinese shore, artillery opened fire. Mortar rounds walked across the ice toward the advancing Soviets, and from the tree line emerged Chinese Type 62 light tanks, outdated by Soviet standards, but present in numbers. What followed was, bizarrely, one of the last tank battles fought on ice in military history. Soviet T-62s, each weighing 40 tons, advanced cautiously across the frozen river, their commanders acutely aware that the ice might give way under their weight. Chinese Type 62s, lighter at 21 tons, could maneuver more freely. At ranges of 800 to 200 meters, the tanks engaged in a brutal exchange. The Soviet 100 mm guns had superior range and penetration. The Chinese 85 mm guns were less effective. But Chinese crews had numerical advantage and could fire from prepared positions on their shore. It was surreal. Soviet tank commander Captain Boris Petrov later recalled. We were fighting a tank battle in the middle of a frozen river in the Far East against fellow communists. The absurdity was overwhelming. But the T-62's gun was very real when it fired, and the Chinese shells were very real when they hit. Soviet artillery, positioned on commanding heights on the Soviet shore, began systematic bombardment of Chinese positions. The Soviets employed BM-21 Grad, multiple rocket launchers, which saturated entire areas with high explosive. Chinese forces responded with their own artillery, creating a hellscape of explosions, smoke, and chaos across the river and island. At approximately 11:45 a.m., a Chinese 122 mm artillery shell struck Soviet tank number 545. The crew evacuated, but tank commander Senior Lieutenant Yuri Babansky was killed by machine gun fire while attempting to reach Soviet lines. His body and his tank remained on the ice, and this would have profound consequences. By early afternoon, Soviet forces had secured Zhenbao Island, but at significant cost. 60 dead and 94 wounded in the day's fighting. Chinese casualties were estimated at 800, though Beijing never released official figures. But the battle wasn't over. It was entering its most dangerous phase. March 16 and 17, 1969. Soviet forces held Zhenbao Island, but Tank 545 remained on the ice between Soviet and Chinese positions, a frozen monument to the battle. Chinese forces wanted to recover it. Soviet tank technology, even a damaged T-62, represented an intelligence windfall. Soviet forces were determined to deny them that prize. What followed was a bizarre, deadly competition, played out over frozen river ice. Chinese combat engineers attempted multiple night raids to reach the tank, only to be driven back by Soviet fire. Soviet recovery teams attempted to tow the tank away, only to face Chinese artillery. The standoff continued for days, with both sides pouring fire on the abandoned vehicle, as if destroying it would erase the reality of the battle. Finally, on the night of March 17th, a Chinese recovery team succeeded in securing cables to the tank and dragging it across the ice to Chinese territory. The Soviets, watching through night vision equipment, could only watch in rage as Chinese forces celebrated. The T-62 would be meticulously studied by Chinese engineers, its armor analyzed, its fire control system reverse-engineered. But the fighting on Zhenbao Island represented just the beginning of the crisis. In Moscow, the Politburo convened an emergency session on March 3rd, still reeling from the scale of casualties. Brezhnev, pale and shaken, listened to military briefings that described not a border skirmish, but a coordinated military assault. This was planned, Defense Minister Andrei Grechko told the assembled leadership. The Chinese ambush was precise. They knew our patrol patterns. They were waiting in prepared positions. This was an act of war. The question hanging in the room was unstated but obvious. How do we respond to a war with another nuclear power? Soviet military planners presented options ranging from limited border reinforcement to full-scale invasion of northern China. Marshal Matvei Zakharov, chief of the General Staff, advocated for a surgical strike on Chinese nuclear facilities before China's nuclear arsenal matured. We have a window of opportunity, he argued. China has perhaps 20 to 30 primitive devices, no sophisticated delivery systems. We can eliminate their nuclear program with conventional strikes. In 5 years, this option disappears. KGB Chairman Andropov presented intelligence showing that Chinese preparations extended far beyond Zhenbao Island. They are reinforcing positions all along the border. They are stockpiling ammunition. They are evacuating civilians from border areas. This is not about one island. This is a fundamental challenge to Soviet territorial integrity. Brezhnev, however, faced domestic and international pressures that constrained his options. The Soviet economy was already straining under military expenditures in Eastern Europe, Afghanistan aid, and the arms race with America. Opening a major war front with China would be catastrophic. And the international optics, the world's two largest communist powers at war, would be a propaganda gift to the West. The Soviet response was calibrated but massive. Reinforcement without full mobilization. By late March 1969, Soviet forces along the Chinese border had increased from 15 divisions to 21 divisions. By year's end, this would reach 30 divisions. More than 400,000 troops, supported by tactical nuclear weapons. The Soviets moved SS-4 and SS-5 medium-range ballistic missiles within range of Chinese cities. They deployed Su-24 fighter bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Soviet submarines carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes began patrolling China's coast. We will not be the first to use nuclear weapons, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko announced publicly in April 1969. But we reserve the right to respond to any attack with all necessary means. The careful wording left open what constituted an attack and what necessary means might include. Critically, the Soviets began diplomatic outreach to the United States, a move that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. In August 1969, Soviet diplomat Viktor Tolstakov approached his American counterpart in Washington with an extraordinary question. What would the U.S. position be if the Soviet Union found it necessary to take military action against Chinese nuclear facilities? The KGB simultaneously launched covert operations to gauge international reaction to a Soviet preemptive strike against China. Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu later revealed that Soviet representatives had explicitly asked whether Romania would support military action to eliminate the Chinese nuclear threat. The answer was an emphatic no. But the fact that Moscow was seriously considering such action sent shockwaves through communist capitals worldwide. In Beijing, the Chinese leadership faced a crisis of their own making. They had successfully bloodied the Soviets on Zhenbao Island, but the Soviet response had been far more aggressive than anticipated. Chinese intelligence reports described the massive Soviet buildup with alarm. "We are facing 30 divisions with nuclear weapons," Defense Minister Lin Biao told Mao in April 1969. "Our conventional forces cannot stop a Soviet invasion. Our nuclear weapons cannot deter a Soviet first strike." Mao's response was characteristically defiant and revealing of China's strategic vulnerability. "Let them come," he told the Politburo. "We will trade space for time. We will wage people's war. They cannot occupy 600 million Chinese." But privately, Chinese leaders understood this was bravado masking fear. Soviet nuclear weapons could devastate Chinese cities long before any people's war could be organized. Chinese strategic adaptation took several forms. First, they massively expanded their underground shelter program. "Dig tunnels deep, store grain everywhere, never seek hegemony," became a national slogan. Major Chinese cities began constructing vast underground networks designed to shelter populations from nuclear attack. In Beijing alone, a subway system was converted into a nuclear shelter network capable of housing millions. Second, China accelerated its nuclear weapons program. The stolen T-62 wasn't just about tanks. The recovery operation demonstrated that China could successfully execute complex military operations against Soviet forces. Chinese nuclear scientists worked around the clock to develop reliable delivery systems, knowing that credible nuclear deterrence was their only real defense against Soviet aggression. Third, and most significantly, China began the strategic reorientation that would ultimately reshape the Cold War. In October 1969, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai sent signals through intermediaries that Beijing was willing to discuss improved relations with Washington. "The enemy of my enemy," Zhou reportedly said, "need not remain my enemy forever." The Soviets, detecting this shift, became even more alarmed. Marshal Grechko presented updated war plans to the Politburo in August 1969 that envisioned a multi-front campaign, Soviet forces striking from Mongolia and the maritime provinces, supported by tactical nuclear weapons if Chinese resistance proved stronger than expected. "We can occupy Manchuria and Inner Mongolia in 60 days, Grechko promised. "We can destroy China's nuclear facilities and industrial centers with conventional and nuclear strikes within the first week." What restrained Soviet action was not mercy, but mathematics. Soviet military planners calculated that even a successful invasion of China would require occupying and controlling territory the size of Western Europe, populated by hostile civilians numbered in the hundreds of millions. The logistics alone were nightmarish, and a nuclear exchange, even one China lost, would still result in tens of millions of Soviet casualties. August-September 1969. The Xinjiang incidents. The border war spread westward. In August 1969, Soviet and Chinese forces clashed in Xinjiang province, where the border was less clearly defined than on the Ussuri River. Soviet forces, better equipped and trained, inflicted heavy casualties on Chinese troops in multiple engagements. Chinese accounts describe provocative Soviet helicopter incursions and armored raids deep into Chinese territory. By September 1969, both sides had fought nearly 24 significant border battles. Thousands were dead, Both nations had nuclear-capable forces positioned for potential use. And the ideological alliance that had seemed unshakable in 1950 had transformed into military confrontation that threatened to dwarf the American-Soviet rivalry in casualties. September 11, 1969. Beijing Airport. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin's plane touched down in Beijing, the first high-level Soviet visit to China since the split. The meeting had been hastily arranged through intermediaries, with both sides desperate to find an off-ramp from escalation that seemed to have its own momentum. The 4-hour conversation between Kosygin and Zhou Enlai was tense, formal, and ultimately productive. Neither side would yield on territorial claims. Neither would apologize for the bloodshed. But both agreed on one crucial point. The use of nuclear weapons in border disputes would be catastrophic for the entire socialist world, as the agreed statement delicately phrased it. We sat across from each other, Zhou later told Mao, and we both understood that we were minutes from midnight, not metaphorically. Actually, Soviet nuclear weapons were targeting our cities. Our forces were preparing for people's war. One miscalculation, one local commander making a decision in the heat of battle, and everything would have been lost. The peak of the Sino-Soviet border conflict wasn't the tank battle on the frozen river or the casualties on Zhenbao Island. It was the moment in late summer 1969 when Soviet military planners seriously contemplated nuclear strikes against Chinese targets. And Chinese leaders seriously contemplated that they might have to endure such strikes and somehow survive. KGB documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that Soviet contingency planning reached extraordinary levels of detail. One plan called for surgical nuclear strikes against Chinese nuclear facilities at Lop Nur and Bao Tu, combined with massive conventional assaults to occupy Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. The plan estimated Soviet casualties at 100,000 to 200,000 in the conventional campaign. Chinese casualties were projected in the millions. What stayed Soviet hands was less moral qualms than strategic calculation, as Andropov noted in an August 1969 memo. American reaction to Soviet nuclear strikes against China is unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. We risk pushing China into formal alliance with the United States. We risk international isolation. We risk a general nuclear war triggered by miscalculation. The intelligence assessment that most alarmed the Kremlin came in September 1969. Chinese diplomats were making discreet inquiries about improved relations with Washington. If we attack China with nuclear weapons, Foreign Minister Gromyko warned, we will drive them into American arms. We will face a two-front Cold War. This is strategically unacceptable. The immediate impact of the crisis was military exhaustion leading to negotiated stalemate. Border talks began in October 1969, dragging on for decades without resolving territorial disputes, but establishing mechanisms to prevent clashes from spiraling into war. Both sides pulled back from the brink, maintaining massive military deployments, but avoiding major combat. By late 1969, approximately 658,000 Soviet troops faced off against 814,000 Chinese troops along their shared border, the largest peacetime military confrontation in modern history. The border remained militarized, tense, and dangerous for the next 2 decades. But the shooting war had ended. The political cost to both regimes was profound. In Moscow, the Politburo faced uncomfortable questions about how border skirmishes had nearly triggered nuclear war. In Beijing, Mao faced criticism for provoking a confrontation with a nuclear-armed superpower that China had no realistic ability to defeat militarily. But the greatest impact was strategic reorientation. By demonstrating that the Sino-Soviet split had reached military conflict, the border war opened possibilities previously unimaginable. American President Richard Nixon, watching the crisis unfold, saw an opportunity. When two adversaries fight each other, he told National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, the time to engage is when both are exhausted. Within months, American and Chinese diplomats began secret contacts. Within 3 years, Nixon would be in Beijing, fundamentally reshaping the Cold War's strategic landscape. The frozen tank battle on the Ussuri River achieved something remarkable. It made the impossible suddenly possible. For 20 years, the Cold War had been defined by a bipolar struggle between American-led capitalism and Soviet-led communism. The idea that communist powers might wage war against each other, not proxy war, not ideological debate, but actual shooting war with tanks and artillery and thousands of casualties, shattered that framework. The Sino-Soviet border conflict proved that ideology alone could not overcome national interest. Former Soviet diplomat Anatoly Dobrynin reflected in his memoirs. We learned that communist solidarity was a myth, that power politics transcended Marxist-Leninist theory, that nations would fight, even nuclear-armed nations, over territory, pride, and perceived slights. For the Soviet Union, the border war revealed dangerous overextension. Maintaining massive forces against China while confronting NATO in Europe and supporting communist movements worldwide strained Soviet resources to the breaking point. The border deployment alone cost billions of rubles annually, money that could have gone to economic modernization or consumer goods that might have prevented Soviet decline. For China, the conflict exposed terrifying vulnerability. The People's Liberation Army, battle-tested in Korea and experienced in guerrilla warfare, proved inadequate against modern Soviet military power. Only China's massive population and strategic depth provided real security, and even that would be meaningless against nuclear weapons. The crisis accelerated Chinese nuclear development and ultimately convinced Beijing that accommodation with the United States was strategically necessary. The long-term impact on Cold War dynamics was transformative. Nixon's 1972 trip to Beijing, the Shanghai Communiqué, and the gradual Sino-American rapprochement all traced directly to the recognition, forged on the ice of the Ussuri River, that China and the Soviet Union were rivals, not allies. The Soviets suddenly faced a two-front strategic nightmare. China gained leverage against both superpowers. Declassified documents from all three nations revealed just how close the world came to nuclear war over a frozen sandbar in a river most people had never heard of. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on alert. Chinese cities prepared for atomic bombardment, and both sides seriously contemplated first strikes that would have killed tens of millions. The restraint shown, ultimately, grudgingly, incompletely, prevented catastrophe. But it was a near thing, decided by narrow margins in Kremlin meetings and Zhongnanhai consultations, where voices advocating nuclear strikes were only barely outvoted. On March 3, 1969, Major Ivan Strelnikov walked across the ice expecting a routine confrontation. Within minutes, he was dead, along with 30 of his men, shot down in an ambush that neither he nor his superiors had imagined possible. That frozen river became the boundary not just between nations, but between the Cold War's ideological certainties and its messy, dangerous reality. That nations fight, that people die, and that nuclear weapons cast shadows over even the smallest territorial disputes. The tank battles on the Ussuri River taught a lesson that echoes in contemporary geopolitics. That adversaries must maintain channels of communication, that escalation has its own logic once started, and that the gap between border skirmish and nuclear war can be measured in hours, not days. Today, Zhenbao Island sits quiet, its sovereignty formally ceded to China in a 2004 border agreement. The island where tanks fought on frozen river ice is now a nature reserve. But its legacy persists. in the nuclear arsenals both nations maintain, in the border mechanisms established to prevent another 1969, and in the recognition that even communist solidarity couldn't survive the cold calculus of power, territory, and national pride.